Ah, welcome, stranger, to the Garage of Terror. I'm glad to see that you managed to brave the dangerous path, as not many travelers are able to make their way here. I shall be your guide this evening through a terror-filled experience the likes of which you have never experienced. Fear will course through your veins, like blood being pumped by the blackest of hearts. You will quake where you stand at— Yeah, this is stupid. I'm not doing that. Just go to the intro. Let's try this again. Welcome, Lodger, to the very first episode of Stories from Beyond the Dark. I'm your host, Tim Sprague. Non-canon July is now officially kicked off on the channel, meaning that the stories that I'll be bringing you over the next month will have absolutely nothing to do with the overarching storyline that normally runs through the channel's stories. Instead, I'm going to be bringing you a completely different storyline that will run over the course of 9 episodes. The storyline has never been released in its full form before. It's always been edited, and not all the stories have been narrated in the first place. So I'm really excited to bring it to you. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you can have some fun and maybe some laughs along the way. So that should get everybody up to speed. So let's go ahead and let's just dive right in with our first story of the night. What do you think of when you think of Paris? There's probably an immediate image of the Eiffel Tower that comes to mind, or maybe the Louvre. Or maybe it's more of an emotional response and your mind turns to love and romance. When I think of Paris, I think of French wine. Some of the absolute best labels and vintages in the world come from France. And even for someone like myself, that isn't an expert on wines at all. It's easy to see why they're so highly regarded. French wine has been a tradition for generations, but it hasn't always been ongoing. When the horrors of World War II made their way into the country, suddenly there was something much, much more important than fermenting some grapes. Our first of 2 stories tonight takes place in that war-ravaged France. The Allies have pushed the Axis out of the country, but as one soldier learns, that doesn't mean that they took all the horrors from the occupation with them. So sit back and enjoy our first story of the night. Mr. Gangley Walks the Halls. Dearest Margaret, I hope that this letter finds you well. I miss you greatly during the entire time away from you. These past few weeks have been especially difficult. While we were busy pushing from Normandy, it was easier to keep my mind occupied on other things. Now that the Germans have left France, however, I've had a lot more time to myself and, as always, my thoughts have turned to you. I have good news or bad news, depending on how you look at things. As you're an optimist by nature, a very glass-half-full kind of woman, I'll give you the positive spin first. You and I are going to be reunited sooner than we thought. I'll be shipping off to the good old US of A within the next few weeks. No matter how optimistic you are, however, you're also a realist, so here's the bad news. The reason that I'll be coming home to you so early is because I have been injured. Now there's no need for worry, as I'm going to be fine. Once the bullets stopped flying in France, my unit had been assigned to deliver cargo to Evian-le-Bon. You've always been more of a scholar than I am, so you may be familiar with the town. I had never heard of it before. There were only 3 large crates, so Mark Johnson and I volunteered to make the delivery. I've written to you about him before. He's a soldier in my platoon that has a wife and young son in Kansas. All of my fellow soldiers are brothers. He's one of the few that I can honestly say is a friend. The round trip between Paris and Evian-le-Bon would take a few days, and we figured that the fresh mountain air would do us some good. We never spoke about it, but I think we both were feeling that we needed to get out of Paris, even if for only a little while. When you see pictures of Paris in books, it looks like this grand place. You can practically feel the magic in the air right through the page. It conjures up images of long walks along the Seine River, or maybe ascending the top of the Eiffel Tower to look out on the lights of the city. You and I even talked about visiting it someday after we're married. I think that's how the city once was, and maybe it will be like that again. In the here and now, though, magic is gone. The Nazis did all they could to stomp out the spirits of the people that lived there. They never fully could, but you can tell that the occupation left its mark in more ways than just those damn red and black banners hanging from buildings. The enchantment and wonder of the city is gone for now, replaced with an iron resolve and a righteous fury. The longer I stayed there, the more that I could feel the violation Paris had suffered through, if that makes any sense. Is it any wonder that Johnson and I jumped on the opportunity to run a shipment through the countryside? It was supposed to be a simple delivery. As everyone in the world knows, though, there's nothing simple about this war. I don't remember the moment that the truck's rear tire struck the mine. It must have been left over from the German retreat, or maybe it had been planted by the French resistance when the Nazis were using that particular road. Whatever the case, the explosion flipped the truck completely over and sent us off the road. I only know this because it was told to me later. I remember sitting in the passenger seat while Johnson drove, idly flipping through a Captain Marvel comic that I had traded a small bottle of half-drunk whiskey to a private for. I'm not much for comic books, but there was something about it that made me feel like... I don't know. It made me feel like I was holding a piece of home in my hands, I suppose. After that, my next memory is slowly waking up. I was lying on something soft, and my body felt oddly cold. Instinctively, I tried to sit up, but the worst pain I've ever felt went through my body like electricity. It felt like someone was forcefully pushing down on me while trying to set me ablaze. I shook my head in an effort to clear it. I hadn't even opened my eyes yet, and I was already feeling dizzy. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and a woman's voice politely but firmly told me to calm down. As I managed to get my eyes open and squinted against the bright light, she went on to explain that I had been in a mine explosion and to assure me that I was going to be okay. My vision returned to normal after a few minutes, and I was able to look up at the speaker. She was dressed in the white uniform of a nurse, with red curls peeking out from under her hat and freckles dotting her nose. She smiled down at me kindly and told me that her name was Ruth. I tried sitting up again, but it had the same result as before. Ruth informed me that I had suffered a fractured sternum when my chest had impacted with the front portion of the transport truck. It sounded serious. She told me that I just needed to rest and it would heal naturally. Normally, ice would have been put on my chest to help with the swelling and lessen the pain. There wasn't any access to ice here, however, so she was using rags soaked in cool water instead. Along with a fractured sternum, I had suffered a painful bump on the head and a sprained ankle. I had managed to escape in surprisingly good condition, all things considered. Johnston hadn't been so lucky. He was lying in the bed next to me, unconscious and his body wrapped in bandages. Every so often I could hear a gasp as he sucked in air. Gasps sounded wet, like they were filled with water. The nurse told me that they hoped he would recover soon, and I could tell by the tone of her voice that she wasn't hopeful. Over the next few hours, Ruth sat and talked with me. Well, she did most of the talking. Even getting a few words out made my chest hurt, so I mostly just sat there and listened. She told me that we were in an old chateau known by the local people as Chateau d'Esprit. It had been the home of a wealthy but eccentric landowner who had died at the beginning of the war. He hadn't had any children or family, so the mansion was converted into a temporary hospital. Most of the doctors and nurses were French, but Ruth was a volunteer with the Red Cross that had been sent to assist due to the place being woefully understaffed. She eventually left my side to tend to other patients. As I stared up at the ceiling, a strange thought entered my head, and despite my condition I found myself smiling. It was a crooked sort of smile. Can you imagine, Margaret? Here I was, relaxing in a fancy chateau in the French Alps, and I couldn't even get out of bed to enjoy a moment of it. I have to admit that I tried not to look at Johnston. Every time I glanced in his direction, I felt an awful stab of guilt. I had survived the explosion and would be back on my feet soon. Meanwhile, he was fighting for his life. It wasn't fair. Even though I had kept my eyes off of him, I could still hear him wheezing and drawing in those wet breaths. Evening came, and Ruth returned to help me eat my dinner. It wasn't much of a meal, just broth and small bits of potato, but I was so hungry that it felt like a banquet. When I had finished, she changed out the rags with freshly soaked ones and put the used ones in a small bucket. Have you ever experienced the kind of moment where it feels like the very air in the room has changed, Margaret? That was what I experienced once Ruth finished her tasks. Her entire demeanor went from warm and friendly to something much more serious. The smile was gone from her face, and her eyes were uncertain. What wasn't uncertain was her firm instructions that, even if I found myself able to get up, I must not leave the room during the night. I pressed her as to why, of course, but she simply shook her head and turned to leave. Ignoring the pain, I grabbed her wrist and asked once more. She hesitated before gently removing her hand from my weak grip. Je gagne les manches dans le couloir, she said quietly in French before leaving the room and firmly closing the large two doors behind her. Sure that I haven't written that correctly, and I'm even more sure that I can't pronounce it correctly, but I was able to understand her well enough. Mr. Gangley walks the halls. I stared after her for a while. To say that I was confused would be an understatement. I was fairly sure that I had indeed understood her correctly, but as you're well aware, I've never had much of a head for languages. It wasn't hard to convince myself that my poor French simply wasn't up to the task of properly translating her statement. With that settled in my mind, I quickly drifted off to sleep. My hand just started shaking so badly that I needed to take a few seconds to steady it. You and I have known each other since we were small children. We started school together. You know me better than anyone else. I'm still afraid of what you're going to think of me when I tell you what came next. You're going to think that I've lost my mind. I don't see how anyone could think otherwise. I swear to you, Margaret, I'm not mad, and what I'm about to tell you is the honest-to-God truth. I need you to believe me. No one else ever will, but you're the one person that has to. Please. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The room was dark and still. I knew immediately that something was wrong. I had the same feeling in my stomach that I had gotten during lulls and battles throughout the war. Sometimes the guns would stop, and an eerie silence would fall over everything. Instead of being happy for the reprieve, you start to feel sick to your stomach because you just know that something even worse than what you just went through is about to happen. That was the same feeling I was having as I laid in the darkness. Something was about to happen. I was so sure of it that I ignored the pain and forced myself up onto my elbows in an attempt to look around. I couldn't stay in the position for more than a few seconds before I collapsed back down onto the bed. Less than a heartbeat after I'd done so, I heard a soft click as the room's doors began to swing open. I craned my neck as best as I could and turned my eyes towards the sound. There was just enough light coming in through the windows for me to see the figure enter the room, but not enough that I was able to make out many details. It was well over 8 feet tall, and it had to duck under the top of the doorway to enter the room. It was wearing a black flowing robe that covered most of its features. As it came forward, it stayed hunched over. It moved with an odd gait, swaying slightly back and forth as it walked. Even though it was the largest creature I'd ever seen, it made barely any noise as it moved across the wood floor towards the beds, like it had very little weight to it. I knew immediately that this giant wasn't human. I know how that sounds, Margaret. This is why I'm afraid that you're going to think that I've been driven mad by the war. If you do indeed love me as you say you do, though, I need you to take what I'm saying at face value and put aside your skepticism until you finish my story. Because of the creature's size, it only took a few steps for it to reach the foot of Johnston's bed. It was starting to lean over him when I closed my eyes as tightly as I could. As I write this, I can feel the shame rising in me. This thing was going to do God knows what to a man that was closer to me than my own family, and there I was, keeping my eyes clenched shut like a frightened child trying to hide from a shadow on his bedroom wall. What kind of friend, what kind of man does that make me? I laid as still as I could for what seemed like hours, but all that I heard was silence. Curiosity started to win out over the fear. I slowly opened my eyes. The creature was still looming over Johnston, but it was completely motionless. His arms were extended towards his face. The robe sleeves were pulled back enough that I could see the limbs. In the dim moonlight, they looked almost white, so white that it was like a single drop of blood had never run through their veins. They were also extremely thin. No, that's not the right word for it. They looked emaciated. Its hands were attached to the arms at a slightly odd angle. I had seen something similar before, when a private had dislocated his hand from his wrist in a bad fall. Its fingers were long and bony, and they reached out towards Johnston's face. The hood of the robe was up over its head, and at the angle I was seeing the creature from, its face was completely blocked off from view. It was hard to tell in the dark, but I got the impression that the head was too large for the body. The width wasn't proportionate with the arms and legs. Everything about the creature was wrong. I felt a sense of revulsion as I watched it. Johnston coughed once. The creature pulled back slightly, but when he didn't make another sound, it drew closer once again. It reached out with one finger and touched him lightly on the forehead. He made a soft choking noise, but remained unconscious. The finger moved down his face, tracing down the nose, across the lips, and over the chin. It stopped when its tip was touching Johnston's neck. The man's entire body had stiffened as if the creature were sending a live current through him. I wanted to yell out, to warn him about what was happening. My mouth remained closed. I was already trying to justify my lack of action to myself. There was no point in letting the creature know that I was watching when Johnston was too injured to hear me anyway. That was what I told myself over and over again. The truth is that I was paralyzed by fear. In the moment that my friend needed me most, I proved myself to be a coward. The creature's hand opened, and it wrapped its fingers around Johnston's neck. He whimpered quietly. Whimpering soon turned into gagging as the fingers closed tightly. I tried to will myself to somehow intervene, fear and fractured sternum be damned. Instead, I just laid there watching. The figure held up one finger on its hand and placed its point between Johnston's clavicles. It lingered there for a moment before pushing down harder. The finger sank into it and through the skin. He started to thrash, but the creature simply held him by the throat as if it was no effort at all. The finger slowly started to make its way down his chest. Skin, muscle, and bone all parted as if it were being cut with the sharpest of a surgeon's instruments. When it reached the top of his stomach area, it withdrew. Blood covered it, and droplets dripped down onto the man's body. What came next has played over and over in my head ever since. The creature reached into the hole in Johnston's chest and pulled the opening wider. The snapping of bone filled the air as his ribs were easily separated. The arm jerked slightly to one side, and a moment later the hand rose up out of the open chest cavity holding a misshapen lump. Johnston stopped thrashing. I must have made a sound, as the creature turned its head towards me. The hood still covered its face, but I knew that it was watching me closely. Instead of closing my eyes, however, I looked right back at it. It wasn't some act of bravery or defiance. I was just too scared to think of anything else to do. It moved to the side of my bed. The gory mass it had taken from Johnston's chest was still clutched in its right hand. I couldn't see exactly what the object was. I was, and still am, thankful for that. The creature regarded me for a long moment before reaching up with its free hand and slowly pulling back the hood. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was stricken voiceless by fear. It was all that I could do to simply keep breathing. Instead of being rounded, Its head was elongated, with malformed protrusions sticking out of the back. It was hairless, and like its arms, the flesh was pale to the point of nearly being translucent. It looked at me with lidless eyes, pupils locked on me so intently that they appeared to be vibrating. The creature's face was vaguely human. Best way that I can describe it is that it looked like a person whose skin had been pulled back so tightly that it had begun to tear off the skull. The large teeth and gums were exposed in a hideous grin, one so large that it ran past the mouth towards the back of the elongated head to show the bone beyond. It tilted its head slightly. I wasn't looking at just some hideous monster. Its eyes stared at me with intelligence. It opened its mouth slightly as it regarded me. Just beyond the first of human-like but oversized teeth were a second row of them. These were smaller and spaced wider apart. Its thick black tongue sloshed around back and forth in its thick saliva.
"Knock, Air Lewis,"
the creature said in a raspy voice, the words coming out as if it was exhaling them rather than speaking them. With that, the creature turned and left the room the same way it had come in, closing the doors behind it. I must have passed out. The next thing I knew, I was regaining consciousness in a room filled with sunlight. I quickly looked over to my right at Johnston's bed. The spot that the bed had once occupied was empty. Ruth came in a few minutes later. I demanded to know what had happened to Johnston. She told me that he had died from his wounds a few hours earlier. I knew that she was lying, of course. I had seen the creature tear him open and end his life. I continued to press her, and as I did so, she grew more and more uncomfortable. She repeatedly tried to tell me that I must have dreamed the entire thing. I became more agitated, and finally she relented. She leaned in as if she was telling me something that needed to stay between the two of us, even though we were the only ones in the otherwise empty room. Every so often she would glance over her shoulder at the doors as she spoke. She told me that Johnston's body had been taken down to the makeshift morgue to be disposed of. When I started to object, she shook her head firmly and told me to remain quiet. The official record would say the body was incinerated due to concerns of a possible disease. That way no one would know about the damage the creature had caused to his body. No one but me. She warned me not to let anyone else know that I had seen the creature, which she again referred to as Mr. Gangley. The few outside the hospital staff that had tried to tell others what they had seen had all died under mysterious circumstances. I needed to remain silent for my own safety. First I refused, but something in the way that she was looking at me made me stop. I got the feeling that she wasn't just looking out for my safety, but hers as well. I began to understand that her current position at the chateau wasn't entirely voluntary. Still trying to wrap my mind around everything that I had seen and that she was telling me, I questioned her about Mr. Gangley. What was it? How long had it been at the chateau? Why had it killed Johnston? Questions spilled out of me as if they would never end. Ruth didn't have any solid answers to give me. All of the doctors and nurses at the hospital seemed to have a different theory. Some said that Mr. Gangley was an experiment that had been conducted by German scientists during the occupation. Others said it was actually a German scientist itself, one that had done things to himself for some unknown reason and was still conducting experiments on the patients in this new grotesque form. She had been told by one doctor that he believed it was a demon that had been summoned by Nazi occultists. I mulled it over. Mr. Gangley had spoken to me in German. Hesitantly, not sure that I really wanted to know the answer, I asked how it had known my name. Ruth looked surprised and regarded me curiously. As she opened her mouth to speak, the doors opened and a pair of soldiers entered the room. They told me that I was being transferred to a hospital in Paris immediately. And that's where I'm writing to you from now, Margaret. I'm sitting at a small table in a private room in one of a dozen medical facilities in Paris. It's been dark for some time, but I can still hear the sounds of talking and laughing coming up from the streets through my open window. Medically, I'm doing much better. My fractured sternum is almost fully healed, and only have slight discomfort from it when I move around. Mentally, I'm not really sure how I'm doing. I have trouble sleeping at night, and during the day I feel like I'm walking through a dream. Sometimes I think about how I failed Johnston and feel a mixture of remorse and anger. And other times I realize that I haven't thought about him in a while. For some reason that makes me even more angry. There are times that I debate with myself whether I should write Johnston's wife and tell her what really happened to her husband. Each time I decide not to. Even if I could figure out how to begin to describe Mr. Gangley and what it had done to him, how could her knowing the truth be of any comfort to her? Scheduled to ship out for the United States 2 weeks from Tuesday. To come to the end of this letter, however, I realize that I can't come back home to you yet. Even if you somehow found a way to forgive my cowardice, I would never be able to. God help me. I have to go back to that chateau, where Mr. Gangley walks the halls. I love you, Margaret, and I'm sorry. Always yours. Corporal Peter Lewis, United States Army, October 14th, 1944. Welcome back, Lodger. Hope you enjoyed the first of two narrations tonight on Stories from Beyond the Dark. I know when we first went into the story that I had said that I always think of wine when I think of France, but I thought that because of the ending of that story, I'd go a little bit more German. So in between the different segments of the show, I went ahead and had a German lager that we had purchased just specifically for this occasion. And that was a huge mistake. It was wretched. I know we're working without a budget here, but it tasted like someone took a leak in battery acid, and that's what I attempted to swallow. But as they say, the show must go on. So a couple of weeks ago, I asked for you find folks to... Oh, God, the aftertaste is even worse. It's like I want to throw up, but my vomit is afraid to touch the beer in my mouth. Anyway, so a couple of weeks ago, I asked for viewers of the channel to post any questions that they might have about myself or the channel in general. As you folks always do, you wonderful people came through. Tonight, I'll be answering a completely random question for those that were asked, and to help me with that, here's the head of the Last Lodge Media Division, the puppet that you folks voted for, Squeakers the Slaughtering Squirrel. Squeakers?
Thanks for the great introduction, Tim. I'm so glad to be here that I probably won't kill you in your sleep tonight.
What?
Don't worry about it. There's nothing you can do about it anyway. What you can do is answer this question that a member of the Lodge community has for you. This episode's question comes from DJ Blodgett from the YouTube community page. It's a two-parter. Question number 1. Would you ever do a canon community contest, art contest, voiceover cameo, or animated short story? They go on to follow that up with question 2. Would you do a choose-your-own-adventure story where you lay down the foundation of a story and then bring the story to a fork in the road and allow the lodgers to choose the path the story will take? Thanks for the questions, DJ Blodgett, and if you could just do me a favor and leave your window unlocked at night, that would make things a lot easier on me when I come to pay you a visit.
Whatever you do, DJ Blodgett, do not leave that window unlocked. So your first question, if we would ever do a canon community story contest, art contest, voiceover cameo, or an animated short story. Yeah, we have actually talked about that. William and I have kind of gone back and forth on that sort of thing. It's not something that we're opposed to. I will say it gets a little tricky in terms of community stories because every story that's on the Last Lodge, with the exception of in non-canon July now, everything's connected. So opening that up to someone else that isn't behind the scenes and knows where things are going or how we're starting to shape things, it makes it extremely tricky. So I don't know if that's something that we're ever going to be able to really do. But with that said, on events like this with non-canon July, that does open up a whole nother section of things that we can handle. So we might do something along those lines. Art contest. Yeah. Hey, we are always open to art. I think William will be the first one to admit that he is not the world's greatest artist. And I'm certainly not either. Things like art, that's actually where one of our weaknesses is as a channel. The art, animated short story, it was on here. Yeah, I mean, animated short story would be great. We just are god awful at animating. I can't speak for William's exact experience with it, but mine, I have attempted it, and everything I make looks like two stick figures that just want to off themselves for being stick figures. So not really the greatest at that one. So yeah, we're certainly open to that. Voiceover cameos, we've actually talked about this, and we've had a number of other channels that have approached us about it, about doing cameos or a collaboration or things like that. We are eventually going to start doing cameos and collaborations. However, we wanted to take some time. We don't have an exact timeline, but at least a year to really get into our own rhythm, to get the people that watch our channel used to us and our style, and to get to know us, and we can get to know you along the way as well. So that will come, but it is something that's going to be down the line a little bit. The second question that you had, would we do a choose your own adventure story where basically it would get up to a certain point and then there'll be a split path and you can follow it? We have talked about that. In fact, we had a long conversation about that a couple of months ago. The issue we had with that one, though, it comes back to, again, everything on the channel, except for when we do events like this, it's all canon. So when you have a split ending like that, suddenly both endings have to be canon, or neither one of them can be. It creates a whole issue in that. So it's something that we're thinking about. It feels like there's got to be a good way to do that, but it may again have to be more of a non-canon thing. It just might not be something that's actually feasible for during the actual course of the year. I know I would like to do it. I grew up on Choose Your Own Adventure books, and I remember how the ones in the 80s were surprisingly gory. I think I had one that had some sort of alien insect thing that, if you took the wrong path, would actually tear the guy apart, the main character. And these things said they were starting, at age 6 to be able to read these books. So they were right up there with scary stories to tell in the dark for me. So I'd love to do one. It's something that I think we can get it to work. We would just have to probably keep it from not being canon. And it also depends on how much we'd want to segment it out. Like, is there only going to be one path, or do we go full choose your own adventure where we use timestamps and you could basically have 100 different ways that the story could play out? So there's a lot of planning that goes into that. And at the moment, we're still trying to establish the channel, but I would love to do that. And I think it'd be cool to do something like that maybe around the holidays. Hopefully that answers your question. Thank you again for sending in the questions. And if you lodgers have a question you'd like to be answered and also enjoy being threatened by a murderous hand puppet, leave your question in the comments. We do read them all. We try to answer all of them that we possibly can. So yeah, leave them in there, and who knows, maybe you could appear on our prestigious zero budget show as well. Earlier this year, we opened the doors of the last lodge, and to say it's been a wild ride so far would be a massive understatement. When we first came up with the idea of a living, breathing horror story universe, we knew that it was going to be a long road ahead of us. This is a massive project, and with only 2 of us working on it, there was no question that it was going to require a lot of creativity, a lot of work, and a lot of hours. This was a brand new world to us. We'd both been writing for many years, but when it came to things like narration and video editing, we were completely clueless. Everything that you've seen on this channel so far is a result of us slowly, and sometimes painfully, teaching ourselves the ropes. There's no question that we're still learning, but the absolutely incredible response from you viewers has driven us onward and upward. From the bottom of our hearts, we thank you for allowing us into your world each week, if even for a little while. We are committed to seeing our vision through and providing the best experience that we possibly can. To that end, we're excited to announce the opening of our very own Patreon. We want to be able to completely focus on bringing you new and exciting content, not just in the narration space, but in other spaces as well. We also want to be able to fully commit to The Last Lodge. Our ultimate goal is to get to a place where we can massively expand the amount and type of content that we provide to our viewers. Through the incredibly generous support of you viewers, we're hoping to be able to bring in new and up-to-date equipment to help us towards this goal, as well as eventually transition into a place in our lives where creating and releasing new content becomes our full-time careers. That's where Patreon comes in. To say thank you for your support, we'll be offering exclusive content to our supporters, with each tier bringing things that we hope you find fun and exciting. As The Last Lodge continues to grow, the benefits will only continue to grow as well. If you're able to, please consider supporting us through Patreon. We take your support seriously, and we'll be using it to grow, expand, and provide you with the best experience that we possibly can. With your help, the sky is truly the limit for the horror and horror-related content that we can create and offer. Please, check us out at patreon.com/thelast-lodge. If you're not able to be a Patreon at this time, don't worry. We're committed to always keeping our currently at least once a week content available to everyone on YouTube. Again, to everyone that's provided the positive messages that keep us going, and both the comments and critiques of the channel, thank you. You're the best community we could have ever hoped for, and we hope that you continue to enjoy what we're creating. And remember, now that the lodge doors are open, all things are possible. We all have things that we're destined for. Many people scoff at the idea of destiny in general, but there's no denying that we're on a path with definite markers. We're destined to grow up. We're destined to become older. In the end, we're all destined to die. If there was a way to change this fate, to find a way to not only cheat death, but to even surpass it, would you? If so, how much would you give to make it happen? Let's look at it another way. If someone else is willing to give everything for immortality, what would you do if you were part of the cost? Keep your answer in mind as we go to our second story of the night, the Destiny Machine. When my mother was buried, I watched as every single shovel of dirt was tossed into her grave. Once the two groundskeepers had finished, I stepped onto the soft soil and spit on her headstone. I was glad that she was dead. The whole reason I attended her funeral was to see with my own eyes that she really was. I don't give a shit if that makes me sound like a bad son, or spiteful, or maybe simply petty. My mother deserves every ounce of venom that is in me. It's because of her that I grew up without a father. Unlike her, he was a good person, the kind that seems to be missing in today's world. In the spring, he would take me to see baseball games, and in the fall, it was football. He didn't do it out of any love of sports. He did it because he knew that I was obsessed with them in a way that only children can be, and he wanted to spend time with me while encouraging my interests. Nothing came before his family. His work, not his own desires, nothing. To this day, I've never met his equal. It's because of my mother that my twin sister is gone. You're not a twin yourself, you understand this, not fully, but losing one is like having a part of yourself ripped away. It creates this hole that's never filled. More than that, though, she was incredible. Smarter than me, and more talented at most things. Although she surpassed me in so many ways, I was never jealous of her. It wasn't her and me. It was us. I lost the best part of me when she died. Sorry, I didn't mean to. I just need a moment. My mother had everything she could ever have wanted. Wealth, power, a husband that placed her on a pedestal above all others, and children that wanted nothing more than to please her. And yet she wanted more. More and more and more. Nothing else. My mother was a woman of excess. Having everything worldly, she instead turned her attention towards the otherworldly. I'm sure that doesn't come as a surprise to anyone here that there are items and objects that defy our limited understanding of science and the world around us. Some people call these things magical, and others call them haunted. Some even say that they're cursed. No matter what you believe them to be, we all know that they're out there. The greatest of these objects is the Fatu Machina. In Latin, it means the destiny machine. From the front, it just looks like an old human skull that is missing the jawbone. The bone is brown from age, and carved along the surface are hundreds of small symbols that join together to form a whole that looks like a map drawn by a madman. Legend has it that the skull belonged to Adam, the first of God's human creations, as well as the first man to have sinned. I have no idea if that's true or not. It's the back of the skull where things get strange. Instead of being solid bone, it's constructed of a highly intricate clockwork-like metal device. Tiny gears can be manipulated using a series of dials and levers, which in turn cause plates and rods to change positions. There are millions, if not billions, of possible combinations. I'm sure someone can work out the exact number, but it really doesn't matter. What matters is the Fatu Machina is a key that unlocks reality. It creates openings between places in our world and gateways leading to others. Imagine being able to stand up from your chair and simply take a step forward to be in the middle of Nepal. You could take an instantaneous trip to Bermuda, or if colder weather is more your preference, visit an outpost in Antarctica. How about stepping foot on a world countless light years away from the speck of dust we call Earth? Maybe journey to an alternate reality where up is down and down is up. If you could appear before whatever creator you believe in and speak to them, would you? That's what the Fatu Machina does. It presents you with endless possibilities. There's a catch, of course. It seems like there always is. To open a doorway, you have to find the right combination. You have to adjust the various dials and levers to the correct positions. Each door is a different combination. There's no way to know what combination unlocks what door except for trial and error. There aren't many stories about the Fatu Machina, and it's been a closely guarded secret by everyone that has possessed it. Everyone that has heard about the device knows one particular legend, though, and I suspect that the reason that you're here is because of that legend. Fatu Machina is supposed to be the only key in existence that can open the way to the Garden of Eden. If you're not caught up in your basic Sunday school, the Garden of Eden is, according to the Bible, the place where all life on earth began. It is home to many wonders, with two in particular standing out from the rest. Two trees grow in the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. Eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil bestows you with the collected wisdom of the world. You essentially gain the knowledge and understanding of everything that has, will, and can happen. It's as close to omniscience as a mortal being can come. Tree of life. Now that's the real prize, isn't it? One bite of its fruit grants you everlasting life. Not just immortality either. It gives you eternal youth at your absolute best. You're immune to poisons and toxins and every affliction. You will live a perfect, unending life until our universe is just a distant memory. If you ate from both trees, is there really a difference between what you would become and a god? It was the legend of the Tree of Life that drove my mother's obsession with the Fatu Machina. All of her wealth and possessions would be nothing if she just died like everybody else. She refused to believe that there was an obstacle that even she couldn't overcome. I'm not surprised that she managed to obtain it. When my mother wanted something, there was nothing that could stand in her way. She was a force of nature. I don't know exactly how she came to possess it, but I wouldn't put anything past her. I imagine there's at least one body buried in an unmarked grave somewhere due to her actions. From the moment her assistant put the black box containing the Fatu Machina in her hands, nothing else mattered to her. She locked herself in her study for days at a time as she tried combination after combination, carefully logging each attempt in a leather-bound journal. The only time that anyone saw her was when she emerged to eat or, on rare occasions, go to sleep for short periods of time. My father tried his best to coax her out of her obsession. I've never understood why. He really did love her. My sister and I said that we did, and I think there was some kind of connection there, but he actually felt that way about her. He was concerned for her well-being and did everything that he could to distract her from her work. Ultimately, his efforts were in vain. I don't know how many successful combinations my mother discovered during this time. The vast majority of combinations don't do anything. Only specific ones will unlock doorways. She might have failed to open any, or maybe did find some and simply didn't share them with us. For 5 months, she worked in solitude while the rest of us had no idea what she was doing. On a cold fall night in late October, however, there's no doubt that she successfully unlocked a doorway to another world. I had no way of knowing most of what I've told you up to this point when it actually happened. I was only 12, and I had never even heard of the Fatu Machina. I've learned most of this from reading her journals and through putting together pieces myself. All that I knew on that particular night was that I was suddenly sitting awake in my bed in the middle of the night in a pitch-black bedroom. My room had never been that dark before. There was always at least some light that managed to make it through my curtains during the night. Sometimes it wasn't very much, but there was still something. On this particular evening, though, I was surrounded by pure blackness. I'm not sure how long I sat there staring into nothingness before I noticed the voices. They were extremely faint, barely qualifying as whispers, and there seemed to be dozens of them. I strained my ears in an attempt to figure out what they were saying. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out the words. Or maybe I could, and I just didn't understand what they meant. Even though I didn't comprehend the words themselves, somehow the messages they were conveying were clear. I'm not sure how to explain it. On some level, I just knew what the voices were telling me to do. They put thoughts into my head that would never have come to me under normal circumstances. I felt a powerful urge to listen to those whispers and do as they instructed. What they were saying made so much sense. Life was hard, lonely, and full of disappointments. Trying to continue on with it was pointless. The only thing that made sense was to not play along with such a bad cosmic joke, to tie my bedsheet around my neck in the way the voices were directing me to, and put a stop to the endless cycle of pain and disappointment. I think that if I was any older, I would have done just that. At my age, though, some of the concepts the voices were communicating to me were things that I couldn't fully comprehend yet, and it was that confusion that kept me from totally accepting what I was being told to do. The whispers changed their tone as they became frustrated with my disobedience. The sound suddenly stopped, filling the darkness with silence. For the first time since I'd woken up, and probably for the first time in my entire life, I felt fear. Real, palpable fear. There was something in the room with me. I couldn't see it or hear it, but it was there. It was this kind of pressure that was coming from behind me. It loomed over me and gave off this sense of total malice. It was angry, and it was going to take that anger out on me. Without even realizing what I was doing, I jumped out of bed and blindly ran in the direction I thought my bedroom door was in. I was fully in the grip of panic, and that panic continued to rise as I kept running. And running. I ran much further than I should have been able to in the small bedroom. Long after I should have reached a wall, I slammed hard into something solid. I'd finally got into the door. I twisted the knob and flung it open, hurrying into the hallway before closing it behind me. Before I even had a chance to turn away from the door, I noticed that the hallway was much colder than my bedroom had been. The change was a shock, and my skin immediately began to prickle. There was an odd burning sensation in my feet. I looked down and found that it wasn't being caused by something hot. Instead, I was standing in at least an inch of snow. I turned around and looked up towards the hallway ceiling. Thick white flakes of snow were falling from it. Forgetting my fear for a moment, I stared up at the indoor snowstorm in wonder. Eventually, I shivered as the cold snapped me out of it. I looked around the hallway. All the lights were on. Instead of their normal warm white, they glowed a dim blue. The walls were covered in sheets of ice. Jutting out of the walls near the top were long, thick protrusions that tapered out to sharp points towards the middle of the hallway. They were nearly as white as the falling snow. My eyes fell on a section of wall near me. There was something behind the ice, something that unnerved me even though I couldn't immediately identify it. I stepped closer to get a better look. It was a growth that spread across the majority of the wood, a pinkish, flesh-like mass that resembled raw flesh. I looked back up at the protrusions. I was standing inside of a giant frozen ribcage. I hurried down the hallway with my arms wrapped around my chest in a futile attempt to stay warm. My bedroom was in a different section of the house than the others. When my sister and I had turned 8, we had been given a choice as to which unused bedrooms we wanted. We had chosen ones on opposite sides of the house, with hers being located near my parents' room. We'd always been close, but we both agreed that we needed some space between us or we would drive each other crazy. The hall led into the entryway. This section of the house was in a completely different state than the frozen hallway. It was much warmer, and there was no snow or ice. The lights were also their usual color. There were, however, more bone growths. They weren't ribs, but were instead 4-foot-tall teeth. They were cracked in many places, and many were covered in brownish stains. They stuck out of both the floor and ceiling at random intervals. The floor itself felt soft as I slowly walked across it. It didn't look any different than it usually did, but the texture had a consistency of a firm yet wet sponge. Each step was disgusting. I started to get a bit queasy. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head towards the tall staircase leading up to the second floor. A scream welled up in me, the pressure of it so strong that I thought it would make my chest burst, but it remained trapped inside of me. At the top of the stairs, surrounded by the same pink growth that I had seen in the hallway, was a giant eye. It was so large that it took up the entirety of the second floor landing. Its iris was black, and its blood-red veins stretched across its milky surface. It rolled around wildly as if it was in the throes of madness. I involuntarily took a step back. As I did so, the eye swung downward in its fleshy socket so that it was staring directly at me. Its gaze was so intense that it locked me in place. It felt so small, so weak as it examined me intently. Something began to drip from the eye's iris. First I thought it was some sort of fluid. When one of the drops pushed itself up off the floor on thin, spindly legs, however, I knew that wasn't the case. Small creatures were falling out from inside the eye. Each looked vaguely like a centipede with wispy, tentacle-like appendages extending from their black-shelled bodies. They swarmed down the stairs towards me. The eye spell was broken. I hurried towards the long corridor that contained my sister and parents' bedrooms. The creatures began to make chittering noises as they reached the bottom of the stairs and skittered after me. I made it into the hallway and struggled to close the heavy wooden door that separated it from the entryway. I barely managed to get it shut in time. The creatures continued to make odd sounds on the other side of the door. They made no attempt to break through. Everything that I'd been through collapsed in on me, and I started to cry. Still a kid after all. No kid is prepared to go through something so horrific. Hell, most adults aren't either. I slumped down to the floor and held myself as my sobs robbed me of my breath. It took some time, but I eventually got control of myself. I wiped the tears from my eyes and stood back up, feeling more exhausted than I ever had. I still needed to find my family. This hallway looked the same as it always did. I wondered if whatever had taken over the rest of the house hadn't reached here yet. Whatever the case, I was just glad that I was safe for the moment. My parents' room was the closest, so I hurried over to the door and opened it. There are two images that will always be burned into my memory. No matter how many years pass, I can always see them in perfect clarity. They'll be with me until I die. This was the first of those images. The bedroom was bleeding. Thick blood was running down the walls and pouring off the ceiling like crimson waterfalls. The floor of the room was submerged in it, and it watched through the open... The bedroom was bleeding. Thick blood was running down the walls and pouring off the ceiling like crimson waterfalls. The floor of the room was submerged in it, and it washed through the open door and out into the hallway as it covered my feet up to my ankles. In the center of the room, sitting on his knees with the blood flowing down around him, was my father. He was dressed in his pajamas and robe. His hands were stretched out to his sides with the palms upward like he was holding up two invisible objects. He was moaning, and his eyes were wide with fear. Standing behind him was a figure in a black robe. Its body was completely covered, and a ragged hood made it impossible to see its face. Paying no attention to me, the figure reached out its right arm. The robe slid away from the fingers slightly, and I saw that they weren't fingers at all, and were instead 3 delicate needles. Slowly, the needles pushed into and through the skin of my father's neck. My father gasped but remained still. The figure tugged the needles back, and a small sliver of skin peeled away from the neck while still remaining attached by a tiny flap. Using both hands, it pulled on the sliver over and over again. The skin began to unravel from my father's body. I don't know of a better way to put it. It came off like a pulled string unwinding a ball of yarn. My father didn't move, but the look in his eyes and the few sounds that escaped from his open mouth conveyed the immense pain that he was feeling. When roughly half the skin had been removed from his face, he finally saw me standing in the doorway. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Got the message, though. I could see it in his eyes just as much as I could read it on his lips. Go. I did it as I was told. Slammed the door shut and quickly backed away from it. I was a scared child. What could I have possibly done to save him? Logically, I know the answer to that is nothing. That thing that was killing him ever so slowly couldn't be stopped by a mere 12-year-old boy. That's the logical answer. Logic isn't much comfort on the nights that I lie awake in bed, remembering how I left him to die alone. Directly across the hallway was the door to my sister's bedroom. I stared at it without making a move towards it, my shirt and sweatpants soaked with water, sweat, and blood. I didn't want to go inside. Something bad was waiting for me in her bedroom. I was sure of it. It was something that I had been feeling since I left my own room but hadn't been able to focus on because of everything that had happened. I don't know if I believe the stories about twins having some sort of psychic connection. As one myself, I was never able to finish my sister's sentences or know what she was thinking. I didn't know when she was in distress or hurt when I wasn't around. Maybe some twins have that kind of connection. We didn't. What I do know is that there's a kind of bond that I've never had with another person. I didn't even realize that bond existed, not consciously, until that night. The only reason I noticed it then was because it was gone. My sister was dead. Couldn't explain how I knew that, but I did. I refused to believe what I knew, however. I felt this deep need to prove myself wrong, to show myself that she was alive and well. Putting aside all of my other feelings, I clung to that stubborn need to not accept the truth and marched over to her bedroom door. I hesitated for just a heartbeat before I opened it. I couldn't enter the room. A few feet inside of the door was a translucent red substance that filled the entire chamber from floor to ceiling. My first thought was that the room had been filled with some sort of liquid, but it didn't drain out through the now open door. It instead remained still. While it wasn't completely transparent, it was clear enough that I could see my sister suspended inside the substance. She was floating just above her bed, her arms and legs stretched out to the sides. Her eyes were open and staring off into nothingness. That is the second image that I will never forget. I couldn't look away. I tried, but my eyes remained locked on her. Even when her limbs began to slowly separate from her body and move off in opposite directions, I just kept watching. It wasn't until after the pieces had broken apart and completely dissolved that I closed the door and stepped away from it in a daze. There was one more door in this part of the house. It was at the far end of the hallway. I turned my head towards it. It led to my mother's study. I started to walk towards it. It wasn't a conscious decision that I made. I think I put one foot in front of the other out of a need to put some distance between me and the bedrooms. I didn't want to be anywhere near them, and it'd be some time before I was willing to really examine what I had lost. I had reached the halfway point when I heard a noise behind me. I turned and found that the door leading into the entryway had been opened. Stepping into the hallway was something that I couldn't comprehend. I need you to understand what I mean by that. When I say that I couldn't comprehend it, I'm not saying it was frightening or that I wasn't sure what I was looking at. I mean that it was impossible for my mind, or the human mind in general, to process and understand the being that was in front of me. It was large enough to fill the world, but at the same time small enough to interact with the tiniest of particles. It had both presence and the absence of existence. The entirety of the being was a contradiction that somehow created harmony. Out of everything that I'd seen that night or ever would in my life, this being terrified me the most. It was like I knew on some primal level that it existed my entire life. This was death, and I was nothing before it. It didn't make a move towards me. I couldn't even be sure that it was paying attention to me. Why would it? A single mortal life wasn't worth the attention of the end of all things. Not sure what else to do, I continued towards my mother's study. After every few steps, I would look back over my shoulder, but the cosmic entity remained still. I reached the door and hurried inside. The study was large, one of the largest rooms in the house. Bookcases lined the walls, and display cases containing rare items were scattered throughout. In the center of the room was a wide oak desk. Sitting in a tall leather chair behind the desk was my mother. Her long hair was disheveled, and she looked older than I'd ever seen her. She didn't look up as I approached. Instead, her eyes remained locked on the object she was holding. Fatu Machina. It was operating. There was a white glow coming from inside the skull's eye sockets. I could hear the whirring of gears inside of the machinery. I could feel a pulsating pressure emanating from it. My mother looked up at me and her eyes locked. It was in that moment that I understand that she had done this. It's her fault that my father and sister were dead. I also knew that, while she hadn't wanted them to die, she also didn't regret the decisions that she had made to bring us to this point. The manifestation of death entered the study behind me. I didn't turn around to look. I knew it wasn't there for me. It went around the desk and seemed to regard my mother closely. She hadn't moved an inch, and she didn't even flinch when it reached down and touched her on the forehead. She gasped, but otherwise didn't respond. It could have ended her right there. There would have been no effort needed to snuff out a single candle when it was used to extinguishing entire stars. It chose not to, however. It simply tapped her lightly on the head. With that done, it turned and flipped a lever on the Fatu Machina. The glow faded from the device's eyes, and the whirring of the machine stopped. The death manifestation disappeared, and the world inside of the house returned to normal. The night of horrors was over, and all that was left for me was a lifetime of unforgettable trauma. The bodies of my father and sister were never recovered. They disappeared along with everything else. They are still officially declared missing by the authorities. Most people believe that my father simply took my sister and left with her. Till recently, my mother had been living in a mental hospital. Death's touch hadn't killed her. Touch of such a being isn't meant to be experienced by a human. It drove her mad. She spent the remainder of her days ranting and raving in a private room, locked away from the rest of the world. It was a strangely fitting fate given that she caused everything because she searched for something to set her apart from everyone else. I haven't been able to forget what happened. God knows that I've tried. No matter how many bottles of alcohol I drink or syringes of questionable drugs I inject into myself, the memories remain. I lost everything that mattered in a single night in the worst way imaginable. There's nothing that can comfort someone when they witness something like that. A month ago, my mother died. It wasn't peaceful. The doctors told me that she choked on her own tongue during one of her fits. I can't pretend that I was upset about that. Everything in the world that she had and owned became mine. The house that's fallen into a state of disrepair, the various properties that she had purchased over the years, stacks of boxes filled with trinkets and heirlooms, everything. Those boxes include a small black one containing an old skull with a clockwork-like machinery attached to it. So, that's what you folks are bidding on this evening. Fatu Machina, the key to unlocking universes beyond imagination and realms pulled straight from the depths of nightmares. Can't say for sure which you'll unlock. I can tell you with absolute certainty that, one way or another, it will change your life. Just be prepared for the possibility that something may come through to you instead of you going to it. I also have a second item available for purchase to the person who wins this item. Sealed inside of this envelope is the exact configuration that my mother used the night she unknowingly sentenced my family to death. It is for sale to the auction winner for $5 million. I know that's a steep price. I also know what you're thinking to yourself right now. Given the staggeringly high number of possible configurations, it's almost impossible that you'll stumble across the same combination that my mother did. Why pay so much money when you can take such a microscopic risk instead? That's not the right question to be asking yourself, though. What you should be asking instead is what you would give to keep hell off your doorstep. Answer that question, and then we'll talk. Alright, let's get the auction started. I'm going to pass things back to Mr. Pembroke, your auctioneer this evening. Good luck to you all. And you can't say that I didn't warn you. You know, you have to wonder who would have both the financial means and the dark desire to purchase the Fatu Machina in that auction, don't you? Good news on that front, as that question will be answered during the next episode. Join us next time for 2 new stories in this ongoing series. From all of us here at Stories from Beyond the Dark, thank you for watching, and be sure to check under the bed before you go to sleep.